In the race to be first, you are often leaving many things unsaid or leaving many things behind. Over the last few days, I've noticed that there was a firestorm discussion about how Helldivers 2 has lost 90% of its player base. Now, 90%, that is a big number. That is likely to grab some attention, and for good reason. There's plenty to be said with that, but at the exact same time, I've noticed that a lot of the people who have been talking about it aren't talking about it from a first-hand knowledge perspective. They're outsiders that are looking in and trying to make sense of the numbers, and that's what I'm going to try to make sense. As somebody that has covered Helldivers 2 extensively on this channel, one thing that I can say is this: graphs and data are awesome. I love them, but they tell a story, only for those who are willing to listen. And I'm going to tell that story today. The story of a cultural phenomenon known as Helldivers 2. Its sunrise and its sunset. The funny thing is about sunsets is that we almost always see another sunrise. Now, when we talk about the rise and fall of games, we often look at two major plot points on a graph, its peak and its lowest point. However, there are so many points that go unmentioned and bring a higher level of understanding into the conversation. Now, before we start on the graph, I think we need to start off the graph by asking, who is Arrowhead Studios, what are they trying to do, and where did they come from? Arrowhead Game Studios is a Swedish development company that has built a solid reputation for itself creating engaging, cooperative experiences. Founded back in 2008 by a group of passionate developers led by Johan Pilstead, Arrowhead quickly made a name for itself with the release of its debut title, Magicka, a top-down action game that stood out for its unique spellcasting and humor, garnering a dedicated fan base and critical acclaim at the exact same time. The success of Magicka set the stage so that Arrowhead could continue building on their creative vision and refine whatever that vision is. Now, following the release of Magicka, Arrowhead continued to expand its portfolio with games like the Showdown Effect and Gauntlet Slayer Edition. However, it was the release of Helldivers in 2015 that Arrowhead really made a name for itself within a niche audience, selling over 1 million copies worldwide. Helldivers was celebrated for its challenging gameplay, propaganda-fueled satire narrative, and the necessity for players to work together in order to succeed. Helldivers was a twin-stick 4-player co-op shooter. Players would select a planet, drop in, complete missions, and then extract. Every successful mission would fill a liberation rate for those planets, and successful or failed liberations would push the narrative forward. The most unique part about Helldivers was its evolving narrative. As time would go on, major orders and events would push that narrative forward by players' actions. Content was slowly but consistently drip-fed into the game, introducing bosses, new factions, and new explorable areas, which is a major contrast to how many modern games typically use their expansions or seasons to be able to introduce new content. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the studio's past as well as Helldivers 1 is because the loss in players for Helldivers 2 is being talked about with a very narrow perspective. One of the claims and discussions that I've seen around Helldivers 2 is how it was part of Sony's big plans to make a splash in the live service market. However, outside of this being a Sony-published game, I've seen no mention by Sony that Helldivers 2 was a part of that plan. In fact, if that was the case, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to put that kind of pressure onto a 100-person studio whose best live service game peaked at over 6K concurrent players on Steam with an average of 400 players today. This was not the horse that Sony was betting on, and it's a success that was a surprise to everyone, Sony included. Now, outside of fans of the first game, there was only mild interest in Helldivers 2 leading up to the game's launch. Keep in mind that the game only had server capacity at launch for 250,000 players, with the first increase taking up to 360,000 players. Helldivers 2 was a bona fide overnight success, launching with a respectable 64 concurrent players on Steam, and then almost quadrupling it within a week after its launch. Fueled by a cultural lightning-in-a-bottle moment where players had banded around the themes of war, brotherhood, memes, the clips of goofy moments, and the game's insane cinematic moments. Without a second thought, due to the wild success of Helldivers 2, many critics, journalists, and even players thoughtlessly expanded their expectations of Helldivers 2 outside of the game's initial intent and its humble beginnings. I think what really motivated me to make this video in the first place is the fact that I saw journalists that were kind of co-opting Helldivers 2 into this narrative that Sony's trying to make a big push into live service, which they are. They've definitely invested a lot of money trying to get into live service games, but I don't think that Helldivers 2 is a part of that plan. Because Helldivers 2 was already a Sony exclusive. The first one was a Sony exclusive. It was on PS3, PS4, and the Vita, I believe. And it was a success, but it wasn't a major success by any means. And why would you want to try to bet on something like that? They only doubled the budget in Helldivers 2 after they had seen the game like halfway through development. So again, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And with that said, I've said this from the very beginning. Many of my videos, you can go back and look at them. Every time I brought up the player counts, I knew that Helldivers 2 was never at a realistic number. 450,000, 200,000, 100,000 players. Come on, man. That's just not what kind of game this is. And I think what people fail to realize is that this was just a cultural moment. It was a phenomenon more than anything else. I look at it very similarly to what happened with Monster Hunter World and the Return to World, where people just wanted to be a part of something really cool that was happening right there in the moment, and they did, and they had fun, and they had a great time, and there was content and videos and all kinds of things that were shared. Then people move on and go play other things because that's just what we do. We move on and go play other things. Helldivers 2 isn't failing. Helldivers 2 is just a game that it's always been. Helldivers 2 has a compelling narrative, an ongoing galactic war that you want to be a part of. I brought up in a recent video of mine how I was kicking myself because I wasn't there when Helldivers blew up a planet, turning it into a black hole. However, outside of the great gameplay and funny moments, there really isn't anything as a live service to bring players back and lock them in for an extended period of time, and that was done on purpose. I mean, let's look at the way the game is built. We can collect more in-game currency than we can even use. Major orders that you've missed will still pay out, even if you haven't played in months. Hell, you could walk away from the game for a year and come back absolutely stacked on medals, ready to drill through whatever war bond you want because you can unlock them whenever you want to, whichever ones you want to. They stack up over time, and you can pick whatever weapons and cosmetics that you want. If Helldivers 2 was meant to be a 100K plus concurrent live service game, it would have vertical progression, classes, weapon upgrades, attachments. Hell, they would actually go and use and leverage the fact that the game's an extraction shooter to make sure that you're extracting with materials and craftable upgrades to make weapons or things like that, similar to Tarkov. However, it doesn't have anything like that. Helldivers 2 isn't a game that's built to keep you in. It's a game that you can walk away from and come back anytime that you want to. Just as not every indie or AA CRPG is aiming to be the next Baldur's Gate 3, not every indie or AA live service game is trying to build the next live service giant. I find it odd that Paul Tossi over on Forbes wrote an article talking about Helldivers 2 as if the game had failed, comparing the game to player counts of games like GTA Online, PUBG, and Fortnite, while ignoring the type of game that Helldivers 2 is and the games that it actually is trying to compete with. FPS games and battle royales offer players an experience where they are competitively playing against other players, trying to improve their own ability through repetition. MMOs like World of Warcraft, Destiny 2, and Warframe have pinnacle content, PvP, and vertical progression in both character building and randomized loot. These games have a reason for players to play every single day. They were built with that in mind. Now, I brought this up in one of my last videos on Helldivers 2, where I discussed a recent surge in players that came back to Helldivers after a major content update where they rebalanced a bunch of weapons and just overall made the game feel better to play. And the game shot up to almost 100K concurrent players and stayed strong over that weekend. However, Helldivers 2 is a co-op horde shooter. It's repetitive. Its cycle of gameplay is basically just fight off enemies, complete side objectives, and survive. Its direct comparisons that you can make to it are Vermintide, Darktide, and Deep Rock Galactic. None of these games have massive concurrent player numbers or hold them for very long periods. Hell, most of them, none of them have ever hit the peaks that Helldivers 2 has. Within its genre, Helldivers 2 is the most successful game to date. And I think that's an important distinction to make, instead of just throwing more fuel on the fire to the player count death cult that we've seen crop up over the last few years that only serves to drive players away because they want to play whatever's popular in that moment. And when you're not adding that kind of context, well, it doesn't really do a lot to help the players, and it doesn't do a whole lot to help the game. I just feel like it does a major disservice to the reader, to the viewer, to everybody else when you just point out the number and show how the game has fallen off, and you're not putting in the context of what kind of game this is. It's not that kind of game. And the best comparison that I can make, or at least one that I can bring off the top of my head, is something like Final Fantasy XIV. It sees major dips and dives in its player base, and that's because people come in to enjoy the major content, they enjoy the story and things like that, and those players leave. There's people that stick around, for sure. There's people that keep playing the game, but outside of that, the biggest waves that you see are always with the biggest releases in content. And that's what this is. You know, for years now, many of us have been wanting a game like this, asking for games like this, wanting companies to treat us better, but this is what it looks like. When you have a game that doesn't have artificial barriers in place that are keeping you from enjoying all the content that everybody else gets to enjoy, When you have a game that's not sinking its teeth into you and locking you in and forcing you, well, feeling like you're forced to be playing it all the time to make sure that you don't fall behind in content and can't play with other people or whatever it might be. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when a game gives you the freedom to walk away and come back anytime that you want to. You can't look at it and be like, oh, they lost 90% of the players. It's a terrible thing. No, it's a great thing, because just as that 90% can leave, that 90% can also come back at any time, as long as there's enough of a reason for players to want to come back to it. That's a good thing. That's what we want. We want to be able to have that freedom as consumers, as players, more than anything else. And that's what this game represents. We're really quick to throw the victories of these smaller companies in the face of AAA live service games, and then at the exact same time go and start complaining and crying about the fact that the game's not using the same tactics that those assholes use on us. What sense does that make?
If you want to have monetization in the game, if you think that people buying new stuff in the game, I mean, it's a fair assumption. Like, a lot of products work like that. Magic the Gathering, Warhammer, etc., all work by additional purchases. But don't charge $70 upfront and then ask somebody, then nickel and dime people for skins. It's like, it just is wrong. So be kind to users and do live service right by asking yourself, what is the value for the gamers in this game being live service, rather than what is good for the bank account.
Helldivers 2 is what many players have said that they've wanted from live service games for a long time, and the mission of Johan Pielstedt that still hasn't changed even after the game's meteoric success. A game that was made for players, not for the bank account. When you look at the player count day to day, or the player count even today, that's what this realistically looks like when you make games like that. When you give players the freedom, when you give them currency and it's farmable in the game, when you don't hit them with FOMO, players feel like they can freely go and play other games, and that's exactly what they're going to do. Not every game needs to be the next forever game that I think a lot of people believe every live service game should be. While there are some journalists out there that don't understand exactly what kind of game Helldivers 2 is, I understand what it is, and it's definitely obvious that Johan Pielstedt does as well. Back when the game was surging and they had a difficult time trying to keep up with rising player counts, when they were talking about hiring more people on, this is what he had to say on Twitter. The act of overhiring, then to do layoffs, is a horrible practice and a bad experience for employees. Use short-term solutions for short-term problems, such as outsourcing, contractors, or limited time agreements. Who could have thought? Short-term solutions for short-term problems. The reason why he says this is because he knows the success of the game was not the intended success. It was not the expected outcome, or an outcome that they knew would last. A developer that has a game that has its own identity, knows what that identity is, and sticks to it because that's what they know. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. Helldivers 2 is a $40 game that didn't ask you for a shred of money post-release. It gave players one of the greatest online pop culture events that we've had in a long time. The memes, the nights staying up playing the game with your friends, the crazy clips on YouTube and TikTok. Players actually playing and working together towards a common goal. And all the while, still having one of the most ethical game monetization structures in all of live service. It's a game that brought a lot of joy and a lot of fun to a lot of people for a solid amount of time, even though there were huge releases right around the corner or during the entire time that people were actually playing that game. Now players are stepping away to play other games, but they always know that they can go back. Now, when Helldivers 2 releases another major content patch, including vehicles, a new faction bosses, what do you think are the chances that we see those player counts surge right back up again before slowly but surely coming back down? A game where players know that they can log in and receive rewards for all past major orders, whether or not they participated. Where they can access any of the past battle passes and progress whichever one they want, depending on whatever items that they want. A game that they knew that they had fun playing, and their friends did too. When Super Earth is in its darkest hour, the Helldivers will return. I think that all too often, we consume games so quickly, we play so many games in succession, that when we see player counts dwindle, and we see the drama around player numbers specifically, that we often will let that somehow devalue the experiences that we had playing that game. And it shouldn't. because I had a blast playing that game. I can't remember the last time that I ever stayed up that late playing a game so consistently, so regularly with friends. Any opportunity that I got to play with people, I was on there and I was playing. And it was a blast. It was so much fun. And something like this doesn't devalue it in the least bit, because this is, for me personally, it was something that I expected the game to get to at one point in time. And I've seen a lot of people that'll bring up PlayStation account login numbers. They'll bring in different discussions around how weird the moderation team can be for Arrowhead Studios. And while I definitely agree, there's definitely some adjusting that they need to do on their community managers. But these are such small things in the grand scheme of the fact that this game sold 10 million copies and people just played it and they're done with it for now and they're going to walk away and go play other things. There just isn't enough content or enough reasons to keep playing the game every single day. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing. And that's kind of the point of this whole video. Not every game has to be a forever game. Not every game needs that. And I would guarantee that this game, especially seeing with what their server capacity was at the very beginning, how they didn't really hire anybody or anything like that, chances are they know exactly what kind of game they made because they're the ones that made it. And they have their expectations already set for what that game is going to be. And for them to be able to feed that crowd, specifically the people that want this to be a forever game, they would have to fundamentally change what Helldivers 2 is, and I don't think that's necessary, nor do I think that they ever should. Doesn't make a lot of sense. I just don't see it happening. But are they going to go in and start making actual classes and stats and randomized loot and a bunch of other things? No, nobody wants that. I'm sure somebody does. I guess I wouldn't have that big of a problem with it, but at the same time, that's just not what the developers imagined for this game, so why would we ask them to do something that wasn't a part of this game's identity from the beginning? So yeah. But yeah, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys enjoyed Helldivers 2. You can always go back to it. I know that I will. I haven't been playing it for a while, but just because there's been so many other games to play to begin with, and I've basically done everything I wanted to do in that game, and I'm just waiting for them to do something big, and then I go back to play it, like a lot of people probably will. Anyway, stay cool, stay righteous, stay safe, my friends. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you drop a like, drop a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think the future of this game is going to be. Outside of that, catch me live on Twitch if you guys want to hear me talk about video game news and play video games and things like that. And yeah, that's all I got. Peace.
Family, 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 family.